Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm greatly honored to be here. In a way, it should be someone else here because there are so many people in this audience who are much more knowledgeable about history of my discipline, of our discipline, but I try and do my best. We could start with the debate whether we do have paradigm shifts in history. I don't want to start it. I just like to point to the fact that normally among historians we talk about terms. And this is a list of terms. I think the term started, the term turn became quite prominent in the 80s or 70s, 80s, and we have had about 15, or maybe you could add even more terms to the list, which of course means two things. For one, I will very briefly talk about these terms, only some of them. I have to concentrate on some aspects, and since I only have 30 minutes, I will give a very, very brief summary. The people among you who know more about it may find it too brief. Fortunately, we have time for a debate. Secondly, as you just said, I started being a social historian in the 70s when social history was sort of opening up to new approaches and to new areas. In German, it was called everyday life or Alltagsgeschichte. From then, I moved to environmental history and sort of maybe some history of consumption. And I assume you will see it in my presentation. There will be some, I wouldn't say biases, but there will be some sort of maybe biases in what I say. Coming back to these terms, of course, I can't talk about all of them. And to be very honest, some of them I don't know very much about. I wouldn't really know what they stand for. And again, you could form groups. You could, of course, say that cultural turn is a broader term which encompasses many of the other terms you see on the list. But coming back to the term turn, what does it mean? In a way, this is a sign. A turn means a major shift in direction, which in history we don't have. I don't think you could use the term major shifts in direction, especially meaning that the whole discipline is moving into a different direction. In a way, as I said before, we don't have it, which maybe just for the better sense, having 14 terms in direction, which would leave us all totally bewildered. Some of my colleagues would say that all these terms over the last 20 years have left us in some chaos, so maybe we've had too many. So what would be an alternative? The alternative, of course, would be to have a tree and to talk about history as sort of starting with some sort of mainstream history in the 19th century, and then adding new disciplines like, okay, so you could say this is how it all started, sort of political history, and then decades later you added maybe another branch like social history, and while political history just went on. Later on, again, we're talking in Germany in the 70s, we added women's history, or later, somewhat later on gender history, which became part or was part from the beginning of the broader concept of cultural history, which I talk about in more detail later. And even later we had global history, which maybe now is 25 years old, as an own discipline, an own strand within history, and then of course environmental history. As you can see from these terms, there are sort of international debates, there are international trends. I will try to talk about these international trends, but I mainly deal with the German situation because these developments differ from country to country. What we have in social history has been, let's say, much more common in the US or in Great Britain for decades before. When you go to France, then of course it's a whole school of the Annals, which you have all these sort of, let's say, national differences or different developments in different countries. So I try to look at more international trends, but at the same time it's very much German-based, because otherwise it would be extremely even more complicated. Okay, so the tree might be a way of presenting it, but then again it isn't, because a tree gives you the impression that all these branches are sort of independent from one another, which if you look at the shifts taking place or the turns, fortunately it's not the case. As I will show later, all these different new approaches were sort of influencing one another. And the other, can I? Okay. So these branches, in a way, of course, are separate disciplines within history, but at the same time, as I said before, they influence each other. And also, you couldn't argue that if you take here political history, it gets sort of thinner and thinner as a tree, the image of the tree suggests, which isn't the case. They stay strong, and political history, as you all know, has sort of enjoyed a new resurgence over the last 10 years. It's now new political history, and they added or learned from all these methodological debates we had over the last 20 years. So the image of the tree, in a way, it's a sort of valuable image because it shows that we now have an enormous variety of topics historians look at, but at the same time it creates a wrong impression in the sense that there's sort of hardly any interaction between these different elements. So maybe you could say we do have like major trends and minor ones. This picture also shows that something which I can't really talk about. History is not just what we do as academics. History, almost ever since, has been done by people we wouldn't call sort of academic historians, or maybe not even professional historians, but it has been extremely important. And again, these are not two different spheres. It's not academic history here and sort of more popular history over there. Fortunately, there sort of exchanges have been going on all the time. And also, we as historians normally don't just write for a few groups of academic historians. Some of the articles we write, of course, are extremely specialized, and hardly anyone except our own very limited field will know what we really want to say. But if you write major books, or like my colleague Leonard, his book on the First World War, on the one hand, it's extremely sort of academic and serious, but then again, it's reaching and actually managed to reach a very wide audience. So you have, again, an even more complicated picture when you look at our discipline. And again, sometimes public history, especially nowadays, is a separate field. I mean, especially in Germany, most of the TV documentaries you do get are produced by journalists. Of course, they do have advisors, historians as advisors, but it's fairly independent from academic history. So you have an extremely complicated picture. Okay, if I had more time, I would talk in more detail about the major elements which contributed to these changes and what these sort of turns consist about. One is we did have an enormous increase in the areas of research and topics historians look at, especially over the last 40 years. It has been quite impressive. Secondly, again, there have been many different debates about methodology, and here the term social construction, I think, will be the one who summarizes it best. As you will know, if you follow these debates, that has been a debate going on among the humanities and social sciences in general. Historians are just part of it, and maybe not the main contributors, maybe are more the people who try to practically or pragmatically use these different approaches. But the whole question of methodology, and here the term social construction, is extremely important. Then, of course, especially over the last decades, the whole idea about narrative. When I was a student, nobody talked about narratives. We just maybe we are not as naive as trying to say how it really was. I mean, this is a famous German saying, wie es wirklich war. But at the same time, maybe again, as a student, I was too naive, but I never came across the term narrative when being a student, which nowadays we all fortunately think about. And then I would also argue that sources, the availability of sources, which has been increasing enormously, again, made major changes. We now can look at topics which we couldn't do 30 or 40 years ago because there's a much wider variety of sources available, and which allow us to pose questions which we couldn't have done a few decades ago. If there's one topic or two topics which are of most importance, it would be the one I mentioned before, social construction. The other one is the whole term, again, of agency, which I will talk about briefly. Going back to my sort of first PhD agency at that term. We just didn't, I wouldn't have known what this term stood for. So these will be are the major areas or the major factors and influences. Okay, then a very brief and very superficial somewhat description, of course, is, as you will know, history, maybe especially among academic historians, has been heavily concentrating upon important, also dead white men, so to say, which has been quite interesting. In a way, it was sort of unavoidable, and at the same time, it was very much a national history. Silvia Palešek and Leonard know so much more about it. Occasionally, of course, we had women. This is John Dark, also figuring prominently. This is a very simplified version, but again, it's not false really. But it's sort of at the same time, in the 20th century, especially, political history became wider. It didn't just concentrate on these famous people. One element they concentrated on was here parties, movements, social movements. Socialist movement, of course, was quite prominent for a while, but other movements too. So political history became much wider. It wasn't just famous men or the occasional famous woman. So there had been developments. But at the same time, I think, again, it's somewhat oversimplifying. But I would say in Germany, again, different in Britain and States or in France, it was in the 60s that social history as its own subdiscipline became prominent and tried to become organized, institutionalized. This is just to show that sort of ordinary people became the center of attention, the center of research, how they lived, what they actually did, and how they organized. And this is miners from Luisenthal, which is in Thuringia in a picture, 1886. So the next step, maybe it's more in the 1970s, is the history of women. At first it was the history of women. It was only later that from the history of women it turned into a history of gender, a more general, a more wider approach. In mining, since I think it makes much sense to quote from my experiences, in the 1970s, nobody wrote about mining and women. There was just the assumption that mining and women were two different spheres. There never was any, you never had any women in mining. Maybe in the special cases, like in the First World War, since there was a shortage of laborers, some women did play some role. But in the 1980s, more and more, at first, female historians show that this is a very one-sided picture. Even in mining, if you go back over time, you do have women playing quite important roles in all different elements of mining, including going underground. What you do have that is in the 19th century, it was legally more and more forbidden, so women weren't allowed to work in the mines, which then created a picture that they'd never done so even before, which by now we know it's not true. So this is what you see in the 1970s, 80s, new topics coming up in women's history. At first was very much sort of trying to show that the role of women hadn't been given the attention it should have been. And parallel to it, you had what I said before, a greater variety of topics historians look at. All these, whether it's the history of consumption, the history of housing, history of the body, of health, of sanity, all these different elements now became part of what historians looked at, and they wrote books about them. Which, of course, as I said, and then it became sort of environmental history. Here, when we talk about Germany, it's the 1990s, 1980s. In Britain, maybe a little earlier. In other countries, even later. And it's still not a very well-established subject, even though I personally, as you know, do it. But in the overall context, it's a minor discipline until today. Sorry, it's a bit. And the other aspect, which Leonard, one of my colleagues here in Freiburg, is a very prominent historian of doing global history, that has been again a major shift in the 1990s, which nowadays includes not just global, different approaches, whether it's a global history or more international history or more entangled history, all these new approaches which now are more and more common and more prominent. At the same time, the picture, as I said before, is extremely simplified. Of course, we did have other sort of disciplines and other developments. There's a book by a German engineer, which you do have quite often in the 19th century, that from different professions, people from within the profession write the history of their profession. And they do have a very, very much an historical background and historical interest. Franz-Josef is one of them. The book of Inventions, Trade and Industry goes back, historically, goes back a long time. You have many other examples here. History of medicine at about this time became an established academic discipline, but you even before had people from this profession having an interest in their own history and writing about it. And you also had what I briefly mentioned, how do you label it? August Bebel was one of the famous socialists in the late 19th century, so it was a sort of alternative, so to speak, history. He wrote it from a decidedly socialist point of view. It's called The Woman and Socialism. It's very much an historical work. He tries to, influenced by Marx, this very extremely long array of how societies develop, class conflict and all these elements. So but at the same time, it's rather empirical. So you do have these elements. And Bebel I show for two reasons. One, because you could call him a sort of socialist alternative. At the same time, he's a representative of a populist history. This book was extremely well sold. He sold tens of thousands. And he was dealing with all the elements which many academic historians at that time didn't deal with, sort of everyday lives of people and habits and so on. So you have both. And you have these elements in other sort of popular histories as well. And of course, for people who know, there was the famous Lamplight tried about methodology and what historians should look at. He was an historian in Leipzig, and he tried to argue for a wider approach for historians to include cultural, economic, and other aspects. At the same time, methodology, he was somewhat, maybe not as professional as he should have been, so it was extremely controversial. And in Germany, it was this great controversy, but he didn't have much of an influence for many years to come. But you still, that's the point I'm trying to make. The picture I gave before is somewhat simplified. There have been broader influences, but at the same time, it's correct too. These influences, on the whole, were sort of more on the margins. So in the 70s and 80s, as I said before, in the more 60s and 70s, when social history became prominent, at the beginning it was more social history of groups or of Strukturgeschichte. Is there an English term? I couldn't find one for. Is it structural history? Okay, so structural history, more the anonymous forces and more institutions and parties, and agency in the sense that individuals from sort of like this guy. I had the picture in my book, but at the time, again, I had some interest in him as a person, but not that big an interest. Nowadays, I would do it differently. I would try to find out more about him. But this, again, I would say is a major shift that agency, the term of agency, not only became prominent, but more and more sort of individual, normal people were seen as agents, and historians try to understand. Here, I could only find out the little information you see up there. He was a miner who did, here at the age of 17, he was earning well. As a young miner in a heavy industry, you could earn good money at a very early age, and so he could show it. And at the same time, he caught pneumoconiosis and died from it a few years later. Or what you see here is a family which shows, what does it show? The picture on the one hand shows the broadening of topics historians looked at. It's a family of miners. This is, oh, sorry. Okay, this is the wife, this is the husband. Here are the three children. This is another son. And here you have three lodgers. It shows, for one, the increasing variety of topics, family life, housing, and all this, consumption. but also the role of women. It's not just that there's women a woman on the photo, but also she's at the center, which is quite, I don't know too many pictures, so I can't really make a comparison, but it's quite telling that she sits in the very center of the family photo. At the same time, it's a family photo, but these people who live in the same family, they're not members of the family, they're just lodgers who pay to stay there. They're part of the family picture too. Obviously, they were seen to belong to the family. So these are new questions which historians posed in the 70s and 80s. And of course here, what was the role of the women in this household, which of course you can only understand if you do see it as a social group, social processes, and her role in it. And here, as I said before, I would say the most important term, the cultural term, came into prominence, and people who know about it just know all this. Going back to my own personal experiences, the idea of social construction of reality really became, I would say, the major changing driving force for historians over the last 20 to 30 years. And the importance of social interactions, of symbols, representations, meaning as an own area of research, and that, of course, different meanings alter your understanding of history. The habitus, and you know all these terms, they, as I said before, mainly didn't come from historical debates among historians as such, but they're part of the humanities and the debates going on among the humanities. For us historians, one of the consequences was the whole idea of nation has changed dramatically. Again, going back to my student days, when I was a student, it was fairly almost descriptive, positivist approach to it. And when this book came out by Hobsbawm and Ranger, it caused quite a stir, that nations were constructions and were part of immediate communities. By the way, one of the authors is Trevor Roper, who wrote in this book a piece on Scotland. My father-in-law is from Scotland, and in his book, in his article, Trevor Roper deconstructed the whole idea of Scottish history, Scottish nationalism. My father-in-law didn't like it at all, and he didn't really want to talk about it. A few months later, by the way, Trevor Roper was one of the people who said the Hitler diaries were authentic, which for my father-in-law was proof that the whole idea was was quite stupid. Anyway, this is just okay. What does it mean for how historians practice their subject today? Political history still is very prominent, but some of it is still very traditional. Maybe you will find occasionally books which still concentrate on important people. But nowadays, if they do it, quite often they do it deliberately. The whole approach, biographical approach nowadays thing, it has become popular again for many reasons, not just because it's a good read, but also there are many methodological stories why you should have biographical approaches to history. But on the whole, so these people still play a major role in many political histories. Nowadays, the approaches are much wider. Methodologically, are much more informed about the new trends, and questions asked are very different. So, what is coming nearer to my end? The branch, the tree picture still has some power of explaining, because we have this enormous variety of topic subjects. But at the same time, to repeat what I said, it's not just that here political history, others just have become slimmer and slimmer. They just change, which I didn't find a picture to show it. I was looking for an image, but I couldn't find one, because it has to be, it should show all the interconnections. When you look at networks, it's different. So I couldn't find one. We have to deal with the tree. But finally, being an environmental historian, I'd like to point out one sort of problem or question which personally interests me most. That's the whole idea about nature and agency in this context. You all know the debate about social construction and nature versus nurture, and whether there's this sort of some reality which it just is there, and which we as historians should try to understand. And so Waldsterben is a very good example. As you know, this was a debate going on in the 1980s in Germany. It was maybe the most important political major issue of the time, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of people, influencing party politics. Everybody was interested in it. And in a way, it's easy, because you see here, you see dying trees. Huh? So you have Waldsterben. On the hand side, we know it's much more complicated, because while this tree might be dying, it's easy. What about the others? Are they sort of healthy, or are they sort of dying, or are they affected by air pollution? Of course, to put it very simply, trees can't tell us. They can't tell you whether they are, how they're feeling. So the people who were involved in this debate, foresters and biochemists and biologists, came up with models, and these models were, for them, sort of near enough to how trees were actually not feeling, but whether they were sort of the state of the trees were in. And so they could, using these models, they could argue that here, for instance, you see signs that the tree was sort of rapidly declining, and so on. And they had extremely complicated models in order to understand what was going on with the trees. It turned out, maybe 20 years later, that all these models were wrong. I mean, I put it too simple. It's not that easy, but that the models didn't really say what they should have said, what they were expected to say. The models weren't good indicators of how trees were actually the state they were in. So it shows sort of one of the major problems we have when doing environmental history, or try to get a different understanding of materials. As you will know, the most recent turn is the material turn. Again, you can show that it's not that new, because material culture has been an important object of scientific research, maybe not among mainstream historians, but in Volkskunde, again, I don't know what Volkskunde is. You don't have the same discipline in Britain as far as I know, but let's say, bitte? Yeah, but anyway, they had a very long tradition in, and you can, of course, when you look at animals, it's quite easy to give nature some agency and to be able to understand them and to maybe even accept them as sort of on same level. But it gets much more complicated when you watch the same miner. This is a picture taken about 1900s. At the same time, miners were suffering from nematodes, a Wurmkrankheit, which was extremely dangerous. And how do you fit these into our agency system? Are they agents? Of course, they were in a way, because they were acting on their own, were influencing the life of miners. But what does the term agency mean for them? Especially, this would be my last picture, coal. Now, as I said before, working on coal and the history of coal, there are so many elements which will fit into what I said before. It will be social history, it will be political history, it will be environmental history, but in the end, what about agency? Some of my colleagues who are sort of maybe more radical than I am argue that even these elements should have some agency, which of course raises enormous questions. What sort of agency are we talking about? Of course, we all know coal, if you burn it, is a major agent because it's contributing to CO2, increase in CO2, so it is a major agent. But does the term agency still have the meaning we normally associate with it if we use it for coal and the consequences of burning of coal? It's just a very open question. I personally find the whole idea extremely fascinating, but at the same time it leaves me somewhat helpless because I don't know what to do with it. I would like to come up with a great idea, but at the moment I don't have it. But this would be coming back to the whole idea about agency, for me at the moment the most interesting, and at the same time leaving me quite helpless. Okay, but maybe that's the last picture. That's a way of how we can combine it all. This picture is in the Ruhr. You see, you could use it for social history because you have these people here. You could use it for the history of consumption. You could use it for the history of the environment. And you could even use it for the most fashionable term at the moment, resilience, which among environmental historians in the environmental debate, it's all about resilience. And if this is not resilience, I don't know what else. Thank you very much.